Marcus Chun had built his empire from nothing. At 42, he controlled a technology conglomerate worth $12 billion, with offices in 30 countries and over 50,000 employees. His mansion in the hills of Beverly Hills stood as a testament to his success. 15 bedrooms, 20 bathrooms, an Olympic-sized pool, and grounds that stretched for acres. Yet for all his wealth and power, Marcus had forgotten the most important things in life. The marble floors of his mansion echoed with emptiness as he walked through the grand foyer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the cold stone. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting rainbow patterns across the walls, but Marcus never looked up anymore. He was always on his phone, always working, always chasing the next deal. "Good morning, Mr. Chun," came a warm voice from the kitchen doorway. Marcus barely glanced up from his phone screen. "Morning," he mumbled, not even remembering the woman's name. She had worked for his family for 3 years, but, to him, she was just another employee. He knew she was African American, probably in her 50s, and she took care of the house. That was enough for him to know. Grace Williams had been cleaning houses for 30 years. She had raised 4 children of her own while working multiple jobs, sending each of them to college through her tireless efforts. Now, at 56, she worked for the Chin family not because she needed the money desperately, but because she believed every home needed someone who cared about the people inside it, not just the things. She watched Marcus rush toward his home office, knowing he would spend the next 12 hours buried in conference calls and financial reports. He lived in the most beautiful house she had ever seen, but it felt more like a museum than a home. There were no family photos on the walls, no comfortable spaces where people gathered to talk and laugh. Everything was perfect and cold. The real reason Grace stayed was because of Marcus's father. Edward Chun was 87 years old, and his body was failing him. Once a strong man who had immigrated to America with nothing but hope and determination, he now spent his days in a wheelchair, his mind still sharp, but his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus had hired the best nurses money could buy, but they came and went like shifts at a factory. They checked his medication, helped him with basic needs, and wrote notes on clipboards. None of them really saw him as a person. Grace saw him differently. Every morning, after Marcus left for his office, Grace would make her way to Edward's room on the 2nd floor. The nurses would be busy with their medical routines, but Grace would sit beside his wheelchair and really talk to him. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she would say, pulling up a chair close to him. "How are you feeling today?" Edward's eyes would light up whenever Grace entered the room. In her presence, he wasn't just a sick old man waiting to die. He was a person with stories, memories, and wisdom to share. "Grace," he would whisper, his voice weak, but his smile genuine. "Tell me about your children again." Grace would spend an hour with him each morning, sharing stories about her daughter who had become a teacher, her son who worked as an engineer, another daughter who was a nurse, and her youngest son who had just started law school. Edward loved hearing about their successes, and Grace loved seeing how his face brightened when she talked about her family's achievements. But Grace also listened to Edward's stories. He told her about arriving in America as a young man, speaking no English, and having no money. He talked about the small restaurant he had opened, working 18-hour days to build a better life for his family. He shared memories of Marcus as a young boy, curious and full of dreams, before success had hardened his heart. "He wasn't always like this," Edward would whisper, looking toward the window. "Marcus used to sit with me for hours, asking questions about everything. He wanted to understand how the world worked, how people lived, what made them happy or sad. Somewhere along the way, he stopped asking about people and started asking only about profit." Grace understood. She had seen this transformation in other wealthy families she had worked for. Success could build walls around people's hearts, making them forget what truly mattered. The nurses barely interacted with Edward beyond their medical duties. They were competent professionals, but they treated him like a collection of symptoms rather than a human being. Grace noticed that Edward's condition seemed to worsen on days when she wasn't there and improve when she spent time with him. One particular morning, Grace arrived to find Edward looking more frail than usual. His breakfast sat untouched on the table beside his bed, and his eyes seemed distant and unfocused. "Mr. Edward," Grace said gently, placing her hand on his arm. What's wrong today? Edward looked at her with tears in his eyes. I feel like I'm disappearing, he whispered. The nurses see my body, but they don't see me. Marcus sees a burden. I feel like I'm
This can't be
already
right.
gone.
The readings
Grace's
are off
heart
the
broke
charts.
hearing those words. She understood that Edward wasn't just physically sick. He was suffering from loneliness and the feeling that his life no longer had meaning or value. You're not disappearing, Grace said firmly. You're right here, and you matter. Your stories matter. Your wisdom matters. The love you have for your family matters, even if they can't see it right now. From that day forward, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She began spending more time with Edward, not just in the mornings, but throughout the day whenever her other duties allowed. She would read to him from books about history and science, subjects he had always loved. She brought him tea and homemade cookies, things that reminded him of simple pleasures in life. Grace also started documenting Edward's stories. She brought a small notebook and would write down the things he told her about his life, his immigration journey, his struggles, and triumphs. She believed these stories were important and should be preserved. Edward began to improve. His appetite returned, and he started asking Grace to help him get dressed in his good clothes each day instead of staying in pajamas. He wanted to sit by the window in his wheelchair, looking out at the gardens and remembering better times. You know, Edward told Grace one afternoon, I used to garden with Marcus when he was small. We would plant vegetables together, and he would get so excited watching them grow. He learned patience from those plants. He learned that the best things in life take time and care to develop. Grace smiled, imagining a young Marcus with dirt under his fingernails, learning life lessons from his father. She wondered what had happened to that curious, patient boy. The nurses began to notice the change in Edward. Dr. Patricia Mills, the head nurse, pulled Grace aside one day. Whatever you're doing with Mr. Chun, keep doing it, Dr. Mills said. His vital signs have improved, he's more responsive, and he seems to have a reason to engage with the world again. In 30 years of nursing, I've seen how important emotional care is for elderly patients. You're giving him something we can't provide with medicine. Grace felt proud, but she also felt sad. She was just a housekeeper, and she shouldn't have been the only person providing emotional care for Edward. His own son should have been spending time with him, learning from him, helping him feel valued and loved. Marcus continued his routine, completely unaware of the transformation happening with his father. He would occasionally ask the nurses for updates on Edward's condition, but he never spent more than a few minutes with him. When he did visit Edward's room, he seemed uncomfortable and eager to leave. He would ask about medication schedules and doctor appointments, but never about how his father was feeling emotionally. Grace began to understand that Marcus was afraid. He was afraid of seeing his strong father become weak. He was afraid of confronting his own mortality. He was afraid of the emotions that came with watching someone you love slowly fade away. Instead of facing those fears, he threw himself deeper into work, using business success as a shield against the pain of watching his father decline. But Grace also saw something else. Despite his coldness, Marcus still loved his father. She noticed how he would pause outside Edward's room sometimes, his hand on the doorframe, before walking away without entering. She saw him looking at old family photos when he thought no one was watching. The love was still there, buried under layers of fear and avoidance. One evening, Grace was helping Edward get ready for bed when they heard shouting from downstairs. Marcus was on a conference call with someone in Asia, and the deal wasn't going well. His voice carried through the mansion as he yelled about quarterly projections and market shares. Edward looked sad. He sounds just like I did when I was building the business, he whispered to Grace. Always angry, always stressed, always thinking the next deal would finally make me happy. I thought I was providing for my family, but I was really running away from them. Grace understood then that Edward's regret wasn't just about his current relationship with Marcus, but about the patterns he had established when Marcus was young. Edward had been so focused on building wealth to provide security for his family that he had forgotten to provide them with his time and attention. It's not too late, Grace told Edward. People can change. Hearts can heal. You're still here, and so is he. Edward squeezed her hand with what little strength he had. I hope you're right, he said. But I don't think Marcus knows how to love anymore. Success has made him hard. Grace disagreed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she made another decision that would soon change everything in the Chin mansion. She decided to find a way to help Marcus remember the love that still existed in his heart. She didn't know how yet, but she felt determined to try. As she tucked Edward into bed that night, she noticed he seemed more hopeful than he had in months. Having someone who truly cared about him had given him strength to keep fighting, not just against his physical illness, but against the loneliness that had been consuming him.
This can't be
Grace
right.
walked through the
The
quiet
results are
mansion
critical.
toward her own small
We need
room.
to act
The morning
immediately.
started like any other Tuesday in the Chin mansion. Grace arrived at 6 o'clock, using her key to enter through the staff entrance. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of Marcus already on a conference call with his Hong Kong office. Grace went through her morning routine, starting coffee in the massive kitchen and checking on Edward's breakfast preparations. The day nurse, Sandra, was due to arrive at 7, and Grace always made sure everything was ready for Edward's care. As she climbed the marble staircase to Edward's room, Grace noticed something was different. Usually, she could hear soft sounds from his room, the television playing quietly, or Edward moving slightly in his bed. Today, there was complete silence. Grace knocked gently on the door before entering. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she called softly. What she saw made her heart stop. Edward was sitting in his wheelchair beside the window, but something was terribly wrong. His head was tilted at an odd angle, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Worse, there was blood on his forehead, and his wheelchair was positioned strangely, as if it had been moved suddenly. "Mr. Edward." Grace rushed to his side, immediately checking his pulse. His skin was cold and clammy, and his eyes were only half open. "Can you hear me? What happened?" Edward's lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. Grace could see he was trying to communicate, but he was too weak. She looked around the room quickly, trying to understand what had occurred. The bathroom door was open, and she could see water on the floor leading from the bathroom to where Edward now sat. His pajamas were damp, and there were towels scattered on the floor. It was clear that Edward had tried to get to the bathroom by himself during the night and had fallen. Grace's mind raced. Edward was supposed to have a night nurse, but she knew Marcus had been cutting back on overnight staff to reduce expenses. The regular night nurse had been dismissed 2 weeks ago, and they had been using a rotating schedule of part-time help that wasn't reliable. "I'm going to get help," Grace told Edward, squeezing his hand gently. "Stay with me, Mr. Edward. You're going to be okay." But as she reached for her phone to call 911, she heard Marcus's voice echoing through the house. He was still on his conference call, and from the sound of it, he was in the middle of a crucial negotiation that could affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. Grace faced an impossible decision. She could interrupt Marcus immediately, but she knew how he reacted when his business calls were disturbed. He had fired staff members before for much smaller interruptions. She also knew that getting immediate medical help was more important than protecting Marcus from the reality of his father's condition. She called 911 first. "This is Grace Williams at 1247 Hillcrest Drive in Beverly Hills," she said quickly to the emergency dispatcher. "I have an elderly man who appears to have fallen during the night. He's conscious, but unresponsive, with possible head trauma. We need an ambulance immediately." While she gave details to the dispatcher, Grace never left Edward's side. She held his hand and spoke to him constantly, knowing that hearing was often the last sense to fade when someone was in medical distress. "The ambulance is coming, Mr. Edward," she said softly. "I'm right here with you. You're not alone." Edward's eyes focused on her face for a moment, and she could see gratitude in his expression. He was scared, but having Grace there seemed to give him comfort. Grace made another decision that would prove crucial. She began to document everything she observed about Edward's condition and the scene of his fall. She took photos with her phone, noting the time and what she saw. She had learned from her daughter, who worked as a nurse, that detailed documentation could be important for medical treatment and legal protection. 8 minutes later, she heard sirens approaching. The paramedics would need someone to let them in and guide them to Edward's room. Grace realized she would have to interrupt Marcus, whether he liked it or not. She ran downstairs to Marcus's office, her heart pounding. Through the glass doors, she could see him gesturing animatedly as he spoke into his wireless headset. Charts and graphs covered his computer screens, and she could hear him discussing profit margins and expansion strategies. Grace knocked firmly on the door. Marcus looked up with annoyance and gestured for her to go away. He pointed at his headset and mouthed important call. Grace knocked again, more forcefully. Marcus's face reddened with anger. He opened the door slightly, covering the microphone of his headset with his hand. "This better be an emergency," he whispered harshly. "I'm in the middle of a $50 million negotiation." "Mr. Marcus, your father has fallen and is badly hurt," Grace said quickly. "The paramedics are here. You need to come now." For a moment, Marcus's face went completely blank. Grace could see the information struggling to process in his mind. His father was hurt. Paramedics were in his house. The comfortable distance he maintained from his father's declining health had suddenly collapsed. "What?" Marcus said, pulling off his headset entirely. "What happened?" "When I found him this morning. He appears to have fallen during the night trying to get to the bathroom. There was no night nurse on duty. He has a head injury and needs immediate medical attention." Grace watched Marcus's face transform. The confident businessman disappeared, replaced by a frightened son who suddenly realized he might lose his father. Marcus ran upstairs with Grace, taking the steps two at a time. When he reached Edward's room, the paramedics were already working on his father, checking vital signs and preparing him for transport. "Sir, are you the son?" one of the paramedics asked. "We need medical history and information about his current medications." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway. He was seeing his father in a way he had avoided for years, fragile, vulnerable, and possibly dying. The strong man who had raised him, who had built a successful business and provided for their family, looked small and broken in the paramedics' care. I don't know," Marcus stammered. "Grace, do you know about his medications?" Grace stepped forward with a notebook she had started keeping weeks earlier. "He takes these medications at these times," she said, showing the paramedics a detailed log. "He has diabetes, high blood pressure, and a heart condition. His primary doctor is Dr. Richardson at Cedars-Sinai." The paramedics looked impressed with the detailed records Grace had maintained. "This is extremely helpful," one of them said. "Most families don't have this level of documentation." Marcus stared at Grace in amazement. She knew more about his father's medical condition than he did. She had been caring for Edward in ways Marcus hadn't even realized were necessary. "We need to transport him immediately," the lead paramedic announced. The head injury could be serious, and given his age and medical conditions, time is critical. As the paramedics prepared to move Edward to the stretcher, his eyes opened slightly, and he looked around the room. His gaze found Grace first, and she saw relief in his expression. Then he looked at Marcus, and Grace saw something that broke her heart: fear. Edward was afraid that Marcus was only there because he had to be, not because he wanted to be. "I'll ride in the ambulance with him," Grace said automatically. "I'm sorry, but only immediate family members can ride in the ambulance," the paramedic explained. Marcus surprised everyone, including himself. "She is family," he said firmly. "Grace knows more about my father's condition than anyone. She needs to be with him." Grace looked at Marcus with gratitude. In that moment of crisis, he had recognized what she meant to Edward, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. As they wheeled Edward out of the mansion, Grace held his hand and whispered to him. "Your son is coming too," she said. "He loves you. He's just scared, but he loves you." Edward squeezed her hand weakly, and Grace thought she saw the hint of a smile on his lips. The ambulance ride to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center was tense. Edward's vital signs were unstable, and the paramedics worked continuously to keep him comfortable and monitor his condition. Grace held his hand and spoke to him constantly, while Marcus sat across from them looking lost and terrified. "I should have been there," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "I should have made sure he had proper night care." Grace looked at Marcus and saw that the businessman's mask had completely fallen away. He was just a son who was realizing he might lose his father before he ever really knew him again. "You're here now," Grace said gently. "That's what matters." At the hospital, the emergency room staff took over Edward's care immediately. Marcus found himself filling out forms and trying to answer medical questions he couldn't answer. Again and again, he had to turn to Grace for information about his father's daily routine, his eating habits, his sleep patterns, and his emotional state. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the attending physician, spoke with Marcus and Grace in the family consultation room after Edward had been stabilized. Mr. Chun has a concussion and some internal bleeding that we're monitoring closely, Dr. Martinez explained. Given his age and existing health conditions, this is quite serious. However, what concerns me more is what I see in his overall condition. Marcus leaned forward, dreading what the doctor might say. Your father shows signs of severe depression and social isolation, Dr. Martinez continued. These conditions can be just as dangerous as physical illness for elderly patients. Depression weakens the immune system, affects recovery from injuries, and reduces the will to fight through difficult treatments. Marcus felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Depression? But he has the best medical care money can buy. Dr. Martinez looked at Grace, then back at Marcus. Medical care addresses the body, but it doesn't address the heart and mind. From what I understand from Ms. Williams here, your father has been experiencing significant loneliness and feelings of worthlessness. Those feelings can literally kill elderly patients. Grace watched Marcus process this information. She could see him struggling to understand how his father could be depressed when he lived in luxury with professional care. What can we do? Marcus asked. The medical issues we can treat, Dr. Martinez said. But the emotional healing requires family involvement. Your father needs to feel valued, needed, and loved. He needs regular, meaningful interaction with people who care about him as a person, not just as a patient. After Dr. Martinez left, Marcus and Grace sat in silence in the waiting room. Marcus stared at the floor, his mind racing with guilt and realization. How long have you known about his depression? Marcus asked Grace quietly. For months, Grace admitted. He told me he felt like he was disappearing, that nobody really saw him anymore. The nurses are professional, but they don't connect with him emotionally. He misses you, Mr. Marcus. He talks about you constantly, remembering when you were young and you used to spend time together. Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time in years. I thought I was protecting myself from watching him die, he said. I didn't realize I was making him want to die. Grace saw the pain in Marcus's face and felt compassion for him. She understood that his avoidance came from love and fear, not from lack of caring. He doesn't want you to watch him die, Grace said softly. He wants you to help him live whatever time he has left. He wants to share his stories with you, to give you the wisdom he's gained in 87 years. He wants to feel like his life mattered to the person who matters most to him. Marcus broke down then, putting his head in his hands as years of suppressed emotion finally surfaced. Grace put a comforting hand on his shoulder, the same way she had comforted Edward countless times. I don't know how, Marcus whispered. I don't know how to be a son anymore. I only know how to be a businessman. Grace smiled slightly. You start by just showing up, she said. You sit with him. You listen to his stories. You tell him about your life, your dreams, your fears. You let him be your father. And you let yourself be his son. As they waited for news about Edward's condition, Marcus began to see Grace differently. She wasn't just a housekeeper who cleaned his mansion. She was a woman who had shown his father more love and attention in recent months than Marcus had shown in recent years. She had seen value in Edward when everyone else, including Marcus, had begun to see him as a burden. Why? Marcus asked. Why do you care so much about him? He's not your family. Grace thought about her answer carefully. Because everyone deserves to feel loved, she said finally. Because wisdom and experience should be respected, not dismissed. Because your father has so much to give, and it breaks my heart to see him feeling worthless when he has so much value. Marcus realized that Grace had been giving his father something that money couldn't buy: genuine human connection, respect, and love. She had been the family Edward needed when his real family had abandoned him emotionally. Teach me, Marcus said suddenly. Teach me how to be with him. Edward looked small and fragile in the hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped softly in the quiet room. His head was bandaged, and 4-line ran into his arm, but his eyes were alert when Marcus and Grace entered. He looked surprised to see Marcus there, as if he couldn't quite believe his son had left his business responsibilities to be at the hospital. Dad, Marcus said, the word feeling strange in his mouth after so many years of formal distance. He approached the bed slowly, uncertain how to behave in this unfamiliar role of caring son. Edward's eyes filled with tears. It had been months since Marcus had called him dad instead of father, or simply avoiding addressing him directly at all. "Marcus," Edward whispered, his voice weak but clear. "You came." "Of course I came," Marcus replied, though they both knew this wasn't obvious at all. For the past 2 years, Marcus had treated his father's medical appointments like business obligations, sending assistants or simply getting reports from the doctors rather than being present himself. Grace positioned herself on the other side of Edward's bed, taking his free hand in hers. Edward's relief at having both of them there was visible in his face. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, then immediately felt foolish. His father had just suffered a serious fall and was lying in a hospital bed. Of course he wasn't feeling well. Edward smiled slightly at the awkward question. "Like an old fool who tried to be independent when he should have asked for help," he said. "I needed to use the bathroom in the night, and I thought I could manage the wheelchair by myself. I've been doing it for weeks." Marcus felt a stab of guilt. His father had been struggling alone for weeks, too proud to ask for help, while Marcus remained oblivious in his home office. "Why didn't you call someone?" Marcus asked. "We have nurses, we have staff." Edward looked away, embarrassed. "The night nurse was let go 2 weeks ago. The part-time girl didn't show up last night. I didn't want to wake anyone for something I thought I could handle myself." Marcus felt his face flush with shame. He had approved the cost-cutting measures that eliminated the full-time night nurse, viewing it as an unnecessary expense since his father seemed stable. He had made a business decision about his father's care without considering the human impact. "Dad, I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words feeling inadequate. "I didn't realize. I should have made sure you had proper care." Edward looked at his son with surprise. Apologies were rare from Marcus, especially personal ones that admitted fault. Grace watched the interaction carefully, seeing both men struggle with emotions they hadn't expressed to each other in years. She decided to help bridge the gap. "Mr. Edward," Grace said gently, "would you like to tell Marcus about what happened last night? Sometimes talking through difficult experiences helps us process them." Edward nodded, grateful for Grace's guidance. "I woke up around 2 in the morning," he began slowly. "My bladder was full, but I didn't want to use the bedpan. I wanted to maintain some dignity, to do things for myself. I transferred from the bed to the wheelchair fine, like I've been doing." Marcus listened intently, realizing he had no idea what his father's daily routine involved or what challenges he faced every day. "But when I got to the bathroom," Edward continued, "I realized I needed help transferring to the toilet. I tried to do it myself, and I slipped. The wheelchair rolled away, and I fell backward, hitting my head on the bathroom counter." Edward paused, his breathing becoming more labored as he relived the frightening experience. "I lay there on the floor for what felt like hours," he said quietly. "I couldn't get up. I couldn't reach anything to pull myself up with, and I was bleeding. I thought about calling for help, but my phone was on the nightstand, and I couldn't reach it." Marcus felt sick imagining his father lying helpless and bleeding on the bathroom floor. "I thought I might die there," Edward admitted. "And you know what scared me most? It wasn't dying. It was the thought that I might die and you would never really know me. That all the stories I wanted to share with you, all the things I wanted to tell you about life and love and what really matters, would die with me." Marcus felt tears threatening again. "Dad, let me finish," Edward said gently but firmly. "I managed to pull myself back to the wheelchair eventually. It took me nearly an hour, but I got back into it and made it to the window. I sat there watching the sun come up, thinking about my life and what I had accomplished and what I had failed to do." Edward looked directly at Marcus. "I built a successful business. I provided financial security for our family. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being present for the people I loved. I worked so hard to give you opportunities that I forgot to give you myself. And now I see you making the same mistake." The room fell silent except for the soft beeping of medical equipment. Marcus felt the weight of his father's words, recognizing the truth in them. "I don't know how to be different," Marcus said honestly. "Business is what I know. Making money, closing deals, building the company. That's what I'm good at. I don't know how to just be with people." Grace spoke up. "Your father didn't know either," when he first came to America. He had to learn everything: the language, the culture, how to build relationships with people who were different from him. Learning to connect with family isn't harder than learning to build a business empire. Edward nodded. Grace is right. When I first arrived in America, I was terrified every day. I didn't speak English well, I didn't understand how things worked here, and I was responsible for providing for a young family. I thought if I could just work hard enough, make enough money, that would be enough to show my love. Marcus leaned forward, suddenly, interested in hearing his father's story. He realized he had never really understood what his father's early years in America had been like. Tell me about it, Marcus said. Tell me about when you first came here. Edward's face brightened with surprise and pleasure. Marcus was asking him to share his story, something Edward had wanted to do for years. I was 23 years old when I arrived in San Francisco, Edward began. I had $47 in my pocket, no job, and barely enough English to ask for directions. Your mother was pregnant with you, and we were staying in a tiny apartment with 2 other immigrant families. Marcus had never heard these details before. His earliest memories were of modest comfort, not poverty. I found work washing dishes in a restaurant in Chinatown, Edward continued. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely paid for food and rent. My hands were always red and raw from the hot water and harsh soap. But every night, I would come home and study English by reading newspapers and listening to the radio. Grace smiled, watching Marcus become absorbed in his father's story. This was exactly what Edward had been hoping for, a chance to share his experiences and connect with his son through storytelling. After 6 months, I convinced the restaurant owner to let me help in the kitchen during busy periods. I learned to cook American food, Chinese food, and fusion dishes that appealed to both communities. I studied every aspect of the business: how they ordered supplies, how they managed costs, how they attracted customers. Edward paused to rest, but Marcus urged him to continue. What happened next? I saved every penny I could for 2 years, Edward said. We lived on rice and vegetables, wore secondhand clothes, and never spent money on entertainment. When you were born, we couldn't afford a hospital, so a midwife delivered you in our apartment. Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. He was proud of his father's determination and sacrifice, but also guilty that he had never appreciated how difficult those early years had been. When you were 2 years old, I had saved enough money to rent a small space for my own restaurant. It was in a terrible neighborhood, with broken windows and graffiti on the walls, but the rent was affordable. I spent 6 months renovating it myself, working at the restaurant during the day and fixing my own place at night. Edward's voice grew stronger as he talked about those challenging but hopeful times. The first day we opened, only 3 customers came in. The second day, 5 customers. For the first month, I thought we would fail and lose everything we had invested. But gradually, word spread about the food and the service. I treated every customer like family, remembering their preferences, asking about their lives, making them feel welcome. Marcus began to understand where his father's natural warmth with people had come from, and why Grace responded so positively to Edward's genuine interest in others. Within 5 years, the restaurant was successful enough that we could afford a house, Edward continued. Not a mansion like you live in now, but a real home with a yard where you could play safely. I was so proud the day we moved in. I thought I had achieved the American dream. You had, Marcus said sincerely. You built something from nothing. Edward shook his head. I had achieved financial success, but I was making the same mistake you're making now. I became so focused on growing the business that I stopped paying attention to what mattered most. Your mother tried to tell me that you needed your father, not just a provider, but I thought working harder was the way to show love. Marcus felt the parallel between his father's story and his own life. When did you realize you were making a mistake? Edward's expression grew sad. When you were 12 years old and won a science fair at school. You came home so excited, wanting to show me your project and explain how it worked. But I was on the phone with suppliers, dealing with a crisis at the restaurant. I told you to wait, that we would talk later. Edward paused, the memory clearly painful for him. But later never came. There was always another crisis, another opportunity, another reason to put business first. You stopped trying to share your excitement with me. You learned that my attention was reserved for work, not for you. Marcus remembered that science fair project. He had built a model of the solar system that lit up and rotated. He had been so proud of it and eager to share it with his father. The disappointment of being dismissed had hurt more than Marcus had admitted to himself at the time. I won first place, Marcus said quietly. I kept the trophy in my room for years, hoping you would notice it and ask me about the project. Edward closed his eyes, pain visible on his face. I'm so sorry, son. I was so afraid of failing as a provider that I failed as a father. Grace watched both men process these revelations. She could see that this conversation was healing old wounds while also creating new understanding between them. But you succeeded, Marcus said. You built the business, you provided for our family. You sent me to the best schools, gave me every opportunity. I provided financial opportunities, Edward corrected. But I didn't give you the most important things a father should give his son: time, attention, guidance about what really matters in life, and help understanding that success without love is empty. Marcus felt the truth of his father's words. He had achieved extraordinary business success, but he felt empty most of the time. He had money and power, but no meaningful relationships. He had built an empire, but he lived alone in his mansion, disconnected from everyone around him. How do I fix it? Marcus asked. How do I learn to do things differently? Edward smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him in months. The same way I learned to build a business in a foreign country, he said. One day at a time, one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time. Grace spoke up. Your father has been waiting for this conversation for years. He has so much wisdom to share with you, so many stories about overcoming challenges and finding meaning in life. But he also wants to learn about your life, your dreams, what drives you, what scares you. Marcus looked at his father with new eyes. Instead of seeing a bee, the next 3 weeks changed everything in the Chin family. Edward's physical recovery was slower than expected due to his age, but his emotional transformation was remarkable. For the first time in years, he had a reason to fight through the pain and discomfort of healing because he had something to look forward to: daily conversations with his son. Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He cleared his schedule every afternoon from 2 to 5 o'clock, marking those hours as unavailable in his calendar. His assistant, Patricia, thought he had made an error when she saw the recurring block of time. Should I schedule the Tokyo conference call during your afternoon block? Patricia asked one morning. No, Marcus said firmly. Those hours are reserved for family time. Schedule all international calls in the morning or evening. Patricia stared at him in disbelief. In the 8 years she had worked for Marcus, family had never taken priority over business opportunities. Marcus spent those afternoon hours at the hospital, then, later at home when Edward was released. Grace was always present during these visits, serving as a bridge between father and son when conversations became difficult or emotional. The first week was awkward. Marcus didn't know how to have personal conversations, and Edward wasn't sure his son was genuinely interested or just fulfilling an obligation. But Grace helped them find their rhythm. Mr. Edward, Grace would say, why don't you tell Marcus about how you learned to drive in America? That's such a funny story. Or she would turn to Marcus and say, your father would love to hear about your first business deal. He's always wondered how you developed your negotiation skills. Gradually, father and son began to relax with each other. Edward shared stories about the cultural differences he had encountered in America, the language barriers he had overcome, and the fear he had felt when starting his own business. Marcus talked about the pressure he felt to succeed, the loneliness of leadership, and his own fears about failure. One afternoon, Edward told Marcus about a particularly difficult period when the restaurant had almost failed. It was 1987, Edward said, sitting in his wheelchair by the mansion's large windows overlooking the garden. There was a recession, and people stopped eating out. For 3 months, we barely had enough customers to pay the rent and utilities. Marcus had been successful for so long that he rarely thought about the possibility of failure. What did you do? I panicked at first, Edward admitted. I lay awake at night calculating how long our savings would last, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake leaving the security of working for someone else. Grace listened from the nearby chair where she was mending some of Edward's clothes. These stories fascinated her too, because they revealed the human side of building success. Your mother suggested we ask our customers what they wanted, Edward continued. Instead of assuming we knew what people needed during hard times, we actually asked them. It turned out that families still wanted to eat together, but they needed smaller portions at lower prices. Marcus leaned forward, interested in the problem-solving aspect of the story. So we created a family-style menu with dishes meant for sharing, Edward said. We offered smaller portions at lower prices. And we started a program where children ate free on Sunday nights if parents bought adult meals. We also began catering small family gatherings at much lower costs than our competitors. Did it work? Marcus asked. Edward smiled. Within 2 months, we were busier than ever. But, more importantly, we learned that success comes from serving people's actual needs, not from assuming we know what they want. Marcus realized his father was teaching him business lessons, but through personal stories rather than abstract theories. These lessons felt more meaningful because they came from real experience and real relationships. As the weeks continued, Marcus began sharing his own struggles with his father. He talked about the pressure of managing thousands of employees, the weight of making decisions that affected people's livelihoods, and the isolation that came with being responsible for so much. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning, Marcus admitted one afternoon. Every decision has consequences for thousands of people. If I make the wrong choice, families lose their homes, children can't go to college, retirements disappear. How did you handle that kind of responsibility? Edward considered the question carefully. I learned that the best decisions come from understanding people, not just understanding numbers, he said. When I had to make difficult choices about the restaurant, I thought about how they would affect my employees' families, my customers' experiences, and my own family's future. Good business is ultimately about creating value for people, not just profit for owners. Grace watched Marcus absorb this wisdom. She could see him beginning to think about his business differently, considering the human impact of his decisions rather than focusing solely on financial outcomes. Marcus also began to understand his father's relationship with Grace. He saw how she listened to Edward with genuine interest, how she remembered details from previous conversations, and how she made Edward feel valued and important. Grace wasn't just providing care. She was providing companionship, respect, and love. Grace, Marcus said one day, I owe you an apology. I treated you like you were invisible, like your job was just to clean and organize. I didn't realize you were taking care of the most important person in my life. Grace smiled gently. I wasn't looking for recognition, Mr. Marcus. I was just doing what felt right. Your father has so much wisdom and love to give. It seemed wrong to let that go to waste. Marcus began to see how wrong his priorities had been. He had hired professional nurses to manage his father's medical needs, but he had failed to ensure his father's emotional needs were met. Grace had filled that gap not because it was her job, but because she recognized Edward's humanity. The transformation in Edward was remarkable. His appetite improved, his sleep became more restful, and his overall health stabilized. Dr. Martinez was amazed by his progress during follow-up appointments. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it, Dr. Martinez told Marcus and Grace. Edward's depression has lifted significantly. His physical health improvements are directly related to his improved emotional state. But the changes in Marcus were just as dramatic. He started arriving at work later in the morning so he could have breakfast with his father. He scheduled fewer evening conference calls so he could be home for dinner. His employees noticed that he seemed more relaxed and made decisions with greater consideration for their impact on people. Patricia, his assistant, was amazed by the change. Marcus seems like a different person, she told a colleague. He's still demanding and focused, but he's more thoughtful about how his decisions affect people. Yesterday, he postponed a major acquisition because he wanted to ensure the transition plan protected all existing employees' jobs. One evening, Marcus found Grace and Edward looking through old photo albums in the mansion's library. Edward was sharing stories about Marcus as a child, and Grace was laughing at tales of young Marcus's curiosity and mischief. He was always asking why, Edward told Grace, pointing to a photo of 5-year-old Marcus examining a flower with a magnifying glass. Why do flowers have colors? Why do birds fly? Why do people speak different languages? I thought his questions would never end. Marcus joined them. looking at photos he hadn't seen in years. "I remember that magnifying glass," he said. "You bought it for me when I said I wanted to understand how everything worked. You were fascinated by cause and effect," Edward said. "You wanted to understand the connections between things, how one thing led to another. That's what made you successful in business. You could see how different pieces of a puzzle fit together." Grace looked at a photo of Marcus and Edward working in the garden together. "You both look so happy in this picture," she observed. "We were," Edward said wistfully. "That was before I got so busy with expanding the business. Marcus loved helping me plant vegetables and watching them grow. He learned patience from gardening." Marcus studied the photo, remembering the satisfaction he had felt watching seeds turn into plants that produced food for their table. "I haven't thought about gardening in 20 years, he said. "Would you like to start again?" Edward asked hopefully. "The mansion has beautiful gardens that no one really uses. We could plant vegetables again, like we used to." Marcus felt a surge of unexpected enthusiasm. "I'd like that," he said. "But you'll have to teach me. I've forgotten everything about plants." Edward's face lit up with joy. "I would love to teach you. Grace could help too. She has a beautiful garden at her own home." Grace nodded. "I grow tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. There's something wonderful about nurturing plants and watching them thrive." That weekend, Marcus did something he hadn't done in decades. He spent time outdoors without conducting business. He, Edward, and Grace visited a local nursery to select plants for a small vegetable garden on the mansion's grounds. Edward was energized by the outing, pointing out different varieties of plants and explaining their growing requirements. Marcus found himself genuinely interested in learning about soil conditions, watering schedules, and companion planting. "Tomatoes grow better when planted near basil," Edward explained as they selected plants. "The basil helps repel insects that damage tomato plants, and the tomatoes provide shade that helps the basil during hot summer days." Marcus was struck by the metaphor. "Like people," he said, "we do better when we're surrounded by others who complement our strengths and help with our weaknesses." Grace smiled at Marcus's insight. "Exactly like people," she agreed. As they worked together to plant their small garden, Marcus realized he was learning more than gardening techniques. He was learning patience, because plants couldn't be rushed. He was learning consistency, because plants needed regular care. And he was learning faith, because planting seeds required believing in future growth that couldn't yet be seen. "This is the first time I've done something without a guaranteed return on investment," Marcus told his father as they planted tomato seedlings. "The best things in life don't come with guarantees," Edward replied. "Love, friendship, family relationships, they all require faith and patience and consistent care, just like plants." That evening, as they sat on the mansion's patio admiring their newly planted garden, Marcus made an announcement that surprised both Edward and Grace. "I've been thinking about the business," Marcus said. "I want to make some changes that focus more on employees and customers, not just profit margins. I want to build something that creates value for people's lives, not just shareholder wealth." Edward beamed with pride. "Tell me about your ideas." 6 months later, the Chun mansion felt like an entirely different place. What had once been a cold, beautiful museum had become a warm home filled with laughter, conversation, and the simple sounds of people who cared about each other. The vegetable garden had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and lettuce grew in neat rows that Marcus, Edward, and Grace tended together each morning before Marcus left for work. The garden had become a symbol of their transformed relationships, requiring patience, consistency, and mutual support to thrive. Marcus's business practices had evolved dramatically as well. Chin Technologies had implemented new policies that prioritized employee well-being alongside financial performance. Marcus had established scholarships for employees' children, created flexible work arrangements for parents, and developed a mentorship program that paired senior executives with young employees from disadvantaged backgrounds. The board was skeptical at first, Marcus told Edward and Grace one evening as they harvested tomatoes for dinner. They worried these programs would hurt profitability. But employee satisfaction has increased, productivity is up, and we're attracting top talent because people want to work for a company that values them as human beings. Edward smiled with pride. Good business has always been about understanding what people need, he said. You're just applying that principle more broadly now. Grace watched Marcus explain his business philosophy to his father, marveling at how much both men had changed. Edward had regained his sense of purpose and dignity, while Marcus had discovered that success could include compassion. The changes in Marcus's personal life were equally remarkable. He had started dating Sarah Martinez, the doctor who had treated Edward in the hospital. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on conversations about meaningful work, family values, and shared interests in helping others. Sarah is coming to dinner tomorrow night, Marcus announced as they worked in the garden. I want both of you to meet her properly. Edward raised an eyebrow. This sounds serious, he said with a teasing smile. Marcus blushed slightly. It might be, he admitted. She's different from women I've dated before. She cares more about making a difference in people's lives than about expensive restaurants or luxury vacations. Grace was delighted. She sounds perfect for you, she said. Your father and I are excited to meet her. The fact that Marcus wanted his father and Grace to meet Sarah was significant. For years, Marcus had kept his personal life completely separate from his family, but now he wanted the important people in his life to know each other. That evening, as they prepared dinner together using vegetables from their garden, Marcus made an announcement that would change everything once again. I've been thinking about Grace's situation, Marcus said, carefully washing lettuce leaves. Grace, you've been working multiple jobs for years, taking care of other people's families while barely having time for your own. I want to offer you a different arrangement. Grace looked up from the tomatoes she was slicing, curious about what Marcus had in mind. I want to offer you a full-time position as our family coordinator, Marcus continued. You would oversee all household management, coordinate Dad's care, and help me with personal scheduling and family planning. The salary would be 3 times what you're earning now, with full health benefits, retirement contributions, and paid time off to visit your own family. Grace was stunned. The offer was far more generous than anything she had imagined possible. But, more importantly, Marcus added, this wouldn't be a traditional employer-employee relationship. You've become family to us. This house is your home too, if you want it to be. Edward nodded enthusiastically. Grace, you saved my life in more ways than one. You brought my son back to me. We don't want you to be our employee. We want you to be part of our family. Tears filled Grace's eyes. For 30 years, she had cared for other people's families while struggling to provide for her own. The idea of financial security and being treated as family rather than hired help was overwhelming. I don't know what to say, Grace whispered. Say yes, Edward urged. Let us take care of you the way you've taken care of us. Grace accepted the offer, and her life transformed as dramatically as Marcus's and Edward's had. She was able to quit her other jobs and focus entirely on the Chin family, while also having time to pursue her own interests and spend quality time with her own children and grandchildren. A year after Edward's fall, the Chin family celebrated an unusual milestone. Marcus had been consistently present and engaged with his father for 12 consecutive months, never missing their daily conversations despite business pressures and travel obligations. 1 year ago, I thought I was losing you forever, Edward told Marcus as they sat in the garden on a warm spring evening. I felt invisible and worthless. Today, I feel valued and loved. You gave me the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that my life mattered to you. Marcus felt grateful every day for the crisis that had forced him to confront his priorities. You saved me too, Dad, he said. I was successful but miserable. I had everything money could buy but nothing that actually mattered. You and Grace taught me what wealth really means. Grace joined them in the garden, carrying a pitcher of iced tea made with mint from their herb garden. Look what I found in the mailbox, she said, holding up an envelope. It's from my youngest son, David. Grace had been supporting David through law school, and they had all been eagerly awaiting news about his final exams and job prospects. He passed the bar exam, Grace announced, her face glowing with pride. And he got a job offer from a civil rights law firm. He's going to help families who need legal assistance, but can't afford expensive lawyers. Edward and Marcus cheered, genuinely excited about David's success. Over the past year, they had all become invested in Grace's family, celebrating her children's achievements and supporting them through challenges. This calls for a celebration, Marcus said. Grace, invite your whole family for dinner this weekend. We'll cook together and celebrate David's success properly. Grace smiled, thinking about how different her life had become. Her children were amazed by the transformation in their mother's situation. Instead of working multiple jobs and struggling financially, Grace now had security, respect, and the support of a family who valued her contributions. That weekend, the Chun mansion was filled with voices, laughter, and the wonderful chaos of a large family gathering. Grace's 4 children, their spouses, and her 6 grandchildren joined Marcus, Edward, and Sarah for a celebration dinner. David, the newly licensed lawyer, spent hours talking with Edward about immigrant experiences and the importance of legal advocacy for vulnerable communities. Marcus found himself engaged in conversations with Grace's daughter, the teacher, about educational opportunities for underprivileged children. This is what wealth should look like, Sarah whispered to Marcus as they watched Edward teaching Grace's youngest grandchild how to identify different plants in the garden. Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. True wealth wasn't about accumulating possessions or achieving status. It was about creating connections, supporting others, and building relationships that enriched everyone involved. As the evening continued, Marcus made another announcement that surprised everyone. Grace, your family has been talking about wanting to start a foundation to help immigrant families access education and legal services, Marcus said. I want to provide the startup funding and ongoing support for that foundation. David could run the legal services division, your daughter who teaches could develop the educational programs, and you could oversee the family support services. Grace's family stared in shock at Marcus's offer. He was essentially offering to fund their shared dream of helping other families who were struggling with the same challenges they had overcome. Why would you do this for us? David asked, overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer. Marcus looked around the garden at all the faces surrounding him: Edward, Grace, Sarah, and Grace's extended family. Because you did something for me that money can't buy, he said. You showed me what it means to be part of a real family. You taught me that success without love is empty, and that the best investments are in people's lives, not just financial portfolios. Edward watched his son with immense pride. The scared, isolated man who had avoided emotional connections had become someone who understood that true success comes from lifting others up, not just climbing higher yourself. Grace wiped tears from her eyes as she accepted Marcus's offer on behalf of her family. We'll help as many families as we can, she promised. And we'll do it with the same love and respect that brought us all together. As the celebration continued into the evening, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been a lonely billionaire living in isolation despite being surrounded by luxury. His father had been a depressed old man who felt invisible and worthless. Grace had been a struggling housekeeper working multiple jobs to support her family. Now, they were all part of something much more valuable than money, a chosen family built on mutual respect, genuine care, and shared purpose. Edward's fall had seemed like a crisis at the time, but it had actually been a gift that forced them all to confront what really mattered in life. The accident had broken down the walls that Marcus had built around his heart, allowing him to rediscover his capacity for love and connection. The story that began with a billionaire who couldn't see past his own success had become a story about 3 families learning to support each other across differences of race, class, and background. It had become a story about how crisis can create opportunity, how compassion can transform lives, and how the most important riches in life can't be deposited in a bank account. As Marcus looked around the garden at the faces of the people he now considered family, he realized that Edward's fall hadn't just changed their individual lives. It had created a legacy of love and service that would continue long after they were all gone. The vegetables growing in their shared garden would feed their bodies for the season, but the relationships they had cultivated would nourish their souls for a lifetime. And through the foundation they were creating together, their love would extend to countless other families who needed support, hope, and the knowledge that they too were valuable and worthy of care. Marcus Chun had finally learned the difference between being rich and being truly wealthy. And in that knowledge, he had found the peace and purpose that had eluded him for so many years. He said, Marcus talked about implementing better family leave policies, creating educational opportunities for employees' children, and developing products that solved real problems for ordinary families rather than just luxury items for wealthy consumers. Grace listened to Marcus's plans and thought about how much he had changed in just a few weeks. The cold, distant businessman had remembered how to be a caring son, and in doing so, he was becoming a more thoughtful leader. As the sun set over their small garden, three very different people sat together in comfortable conversation. A billionaire learning to value relationships over riches, an elderly immigrant sharing the wisdom of a lifetime, and a housekeeper whose compassion had brought them together. None of them could have predicted the impact that Edward's fall would have on their lives. What had seemed like a crisis had become an opportunity for healing, growth, and the rediscovery of what truly mattered in life. Burden or a reminder of mortality, he began to see a resource, someone who had lived through experiences that could help Marcus understand his own life better. "I want to hear more of your stories," Marcus said. "And I want to tell you about my life too. The real parts, not just the business achievements." Edward reached for Marcus's hand with his free hand, creating a connection between all three of them around the hospital bed. "We have time," Edward said hopefully. "If you're willing to make time." Marcus squeezed his father's hand. "I'm willing to learn. I want to try, but I don't know where to start." Grace smiled, seeing hope for the first time in months. "We'll start slowly," she said. "First, you learn to listen. Really listen, not just wait for your turn to talk. Your father has incredible stories about building his life in America, about raising you, about the lessons he's learned. Those stories are gifts he wants to give you." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Chen, your father is stable and asking for both of you. You can see him now." As Marcus and Grace walked toward Edward's room, Marcus felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. He was about to begin the most important conversation of his life, not with a business partner or competitor, but with his father, who was running out of time to share everything he had wanted to say. On the first floor, the house was beautiful, but it felt empty because the people inside it had forgotten how to connect with each other. She had seen this pattern before in wealthy families, but something about the Chin family made her want to fight for them. Maybe it was Edward's gentle spirit and the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his memories. Maybe it was the glimpses she caught of Marcus's buried humanity when he thought no one was watching. Or maybe it was her own belief that every family deserved a chance to find their way back to love. Whatever the reason, Grace Williams was about to become much more than a housekeeper in the Chin mansion. She was about to become the bridge that would reconnect a father and son who had lost their way to each other. The next morning would bring unexpected events that would test everyone in the house and reveal the true character of each person living under that magnificent roof. Grace had no way of knowing that her simple acts of kindness toward an elderly man were about to transform not just Edward's life, but the entire Chin family forever.